Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the FORA Reefs Authority special meeting of the Board of Directors. It is 2 o'clock. I'd call this meeting to order. I'd ask Mayor Dave Pendergrass if you do the honor of leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Dave. Okay, we'll be going into closed session, discussing two major items: Public Employee Performance Evaluation, Executive Officer, Government Code 54957, and Conference for Legal Counsel, Existing Litigation, Government Code 54956.9 Alpha. Two cases. One, Keep Florida Wild versus Florida Reefs Authority, case number M114961. Second is the City of Marina, Florida Reefs Authority, case number M11856. Prior to going into closed session, does any member of the public wishing to address the board on any of these items we're covering in closed session? Seeing no one from the public coming forward, the public comment period is closed. We'll be adjourning in closed session, reconvening in open session next door. We'll be back as soon as we possibly can. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Reconvening the Florida Reefs Authority Board of Directors meeting from closed session. We're reconvening in open session. If our counsel, Mr. John Giffen, will announce action taken in closed session, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair Edelin. The board heard from Authority Counsel in closed session on the items listed under 3A and B, and there's nothing to report out.
Thank you very much, John. Next, roll call. Lena?
City of Carmel by the Sea, Mayor Pro Tem Beach. Here. City of Delray Oaks, Mayor Edelin.
Here.
City of Marina, Mayor Pro Tem O'Connell. City of Marina, Councilmember Morton. City of Monterey, Councilmember Selfridge. Here. Monterey County, Supervisor Potter. Monterey County, Supervisor Calcagno. Monterey County, Supervisor Parker. Here. City of Pacific Grove, Mayor Camp. Here. City of Salinas, Mayor Gunter.
Here.
City of Sand City, Mayor Pendergrass. Here. City of Seaside, Mayor Pro Tem Oglesby.
Here.
City of Seaside, Councilmember Alexander.
Here.
20th Congressional District, Ala Carago. 17th State Senate District, Senator Monning. Here. 29th State Assembly District, Assemblymember Stone. Here. University of California, Donna Blitzer. Here. California State University, Andre Lewis. Here. Monterey Peninsula College, Vicky Nakamura. Here. Monterey Peninsula Unified School District, Dan Alpert Jr. Here. Monterey Salinas Transit, Hunter Harvath. Here. Transportation Agency of Monterey County, Debbie Hale. Here. United States Army, Dan Carpenter. Here. Fort Ord BRAC Office, Lyle Shirtleff. Here. Marina Coast Water District, Director Moore. Chair Edelin, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Lena. This is a special meeting for us. It's our annual state legislative session. We have both State Senator Bill Monning of the 17th State Senate District, and we have Assembly Member Mark Stone of the 29th State Assembly District. We'll start off with Senator Bill Monning to give us an update on what's going on. Senator Monning has a long history in the Monterey Bay region, serving as a member of the Monterey County Court-Decided Mediation Panel, a professor at the Monterey College of Law, a professor at the International Negotiation and Conflict Resolution at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. He's represented the 17th State Assembly District since 2008, has taken an active leadership role in issues related to Fort Ord, most notably his 2012 FORA extension legislation and several legislative and budgetary efforts to facilitate funding for the California Central Coast Veterans Cemetery. Senator Monning has provided immeasurable support at the state level for the Veterans Cemetery and is currently assisting FORA staff in moving the state regulatory review of the HCP, better known as Habitat Conservation Plan. Senator Monning's done a heck of a job with regard to the Veterans Cemetery. We worked hand in glove with him. There's no doubt that that cemetery would be nowhere near where it is now without his active support and help, and we appreciate it very much, Senator Monning.
Thank you, Chair Edelin and members. Appreciate the opportunity to provide what's become known as our annual legislative update. I thought I would briefly comment on 4 areas: update on the Veterans Cemetery, my Senate Bill 936 on water rate relief bonds, very briefly where the state is with the broader state water bond, and the May revise on the budget. Just a very general update on that. With respect to the Veterans Cemetery, as you mentioned, last year we were able to secure, through a combination of sources, $2 million from the state of California to help satisfy the state obligation to move forward with the Veterans Cemetery, and the 0.6 of the 2.6 million, the 600,000 raised through local efforts through the Veterans Foundation, and then the Blue Ribbon Commission led by Mayor Burnett and Jimmy Panetta. And so I just want to acknowledge the tremendous ongoing effort of local communities and veterans community to help us meet these targets. We are moving forward on schedule, and I know there's periodic rumblings and rumors that we're not on schedule and the cemetery project is floundering. I met with CalVet this week. We are ahead of schedule. They are on schedule, working with Department of General Services to achieve in 1 year what normally takes 3 years. They've been in regular contact with U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs and have been going back and forth on preliminary drawings, and all steps are being met, all requirements are being satisfied, and there's a public process that is ongoing and will continue to guide us towards our objective of groundbreaking sometime in October, and moving forward with the cemetery project. There's actually been attention on this from other parts of the state. We now have some colleagues in the legislature looking at what's being called the Monterey model of how to establish a state veteran cemetery site. So I'm actually quite pleased with the work of a lot of different stakeholders, and want to thank FORA for FORA's continued work, and particularly the City of Seaside for its leadership and for granting the transfer of the land along with Monterey County to allow this project to move forward. In the legislature, Assemblymember Stone and Alejo have been tremendously supportive, as has Senator Cannella. So we have a great team moving forward, and again, the real backbone of this project has been the persistence of the veterans community to fulfill this dream. So we're very pleased with progress, and again, want to thank some of those who really stepped up with contributions to help us meet our targets last fall. With respect to my SB 936, that is what we're referring to as the water rate relief bonds. This legislation, it's made it through all committees to date. It's on the Assembly side right now, and it would allow the Public Utilities Commission, it would give them permissive authority to authorize the issuance of public bonds through the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District that could be used in partnership with development of a desal facility or potentially other water resources in a manner that benefits ratepayers because of the benefit of it being a public bond and a lower interest rate for payback. So that is moving forward, and it would be part of a broader equation or broader set of tools to bring in any new water development projects at the lowest rate possible to ratepayers. And it looks not just at potential construction cost, but out years paying back the debt and how that affects ratepayers. It's been supported by a broad range of organizations, from Surfrider to the Monterey Hospitality Association. It's received broad support and is moving forward, again, with support of Assembly Members Stone and Alejo, Senator Cannella, and so far we've had unanimous support on that project, and appreciate the support that FORA has also offered as we move that legislation forward. On another waterfront, you're going to be increasingly reading about state water bond. There's currently, I would say, 6 or 7, maybe 8 different legislative vehicles. As you'll remember, in 2009, the legislature passed a water bond proposal to go to the voters in 2010. Then Governor Schwarzenegger asked the legislature to postpone it to the 2012 ballot. Again, Governor Brown returned and asked the legislature to postpone, now potentially to November 2014. In the meantime, the architecture of that 2009 bond that was over $11 billion has been reviewed, and in light of the drought, in light of a better understanding of the appetite of voters in California to support a bond measure, most of the current proposals that would amend that 2009 bond come in below that $11 billion, and opposed to being project-specific, they are more generically looking at groundwater, at water storage, at water conveyance, at decontaminating contaminated water. So we on the Central Coast look at any of these proposals through the lens of how will this benefit water needs in the Central Coast area. We are not a beneficiary, for the most part, of north-south conveyance from Delta to Southern California. We are largely dependent on groundwater, and so we look at all bond proposals as what resources would be there to help us manage our very precious water resources in the Central Coast area. So there is a conference committee or a water working group that I think is going to be working to pull together elements of some of these various proposals into a bond that can both win 2/3 support in the legislature and be designed in a manner that would win the votes of California voters. We think in this drought crisis, there's going to be much greater interest among voters in being solution-oriented in managing very limited and precious water resources. The drought also plays into our current fire crisis, the fires in San Diego that are burning right now in May. CAL FIRE has said this is the type of fuel and fire that you'd normally see in August and September, and we face the same threats and risks here. I'll just conclude by saying on the May revise, the governor presented his budget in January. We've been holding budget committee hearings, and the May revise is also from the governor's office, where they take their projections from January and compare it to actual revenues and then refine that January budget proposal. We achieved a landmark vote yesterday on what's been referred to as the Rainy Day Fund, with unanimous vote in the Senate, and was it unanimous in the Assembly, a negotiation including the governor and leadership of the Assembly and the Senate, both Democrat and Republican, that would go to the voters. It would require 1.5% of revenues to the state to go into a rainy day fund, but within that rainy day fund, to over 15 years allocate up to half of that to paying down accumulated debt, what we call the wall of debt. Some of that is pension debt, some of that is other accrued debt. So as opposed to just parking it in a rainy day fund, you use some of it to actually build down state liability and improve the state's economic health and ability to issue bonds, etc. It didn't get a lot of media attention, but I think it's a landmark accomplishment for the state legislature and for the state of California in the face of a recovering budget, but still a very fragile budget. And the tug-of-war ahead of us between this May revise and June 15th, when we as the legislature have to return a balanced budget to the governor, is how do we prioritize program restoration, areas that have been cut dramatically or eliminated, and some of the cuts that result in greater costs to the state when we take away somebody's ability to have an in-home support service provider and require institutionalization. That's going to cost the state more in the long run. So I think the budget is in better shape than it's been in the 5 prior years of my service in Sacramento. And yet we're in a slow recovery, and the history of California is recoveries run out of steam and go into recessions. You look back, it's predictable. We don't know when, but we know that we won't continue to climb. We have to prepare for those reduced revenues coming in. And I would just conclude on another project that's important to me in promoting children's health. A very important study released yesterday. It was covered by the Herald in this morning's paper. UCLA School of Public Health identifying that roughly a third of all hospital admissions in California include patients with diabetes, and the added expense of those hospitalizations in managing diabetes. Recommendations in this report include better nutrition, more exercise, and reduction of consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. And it was picked up broadly, not only by media in California, but nationally. And again, Monterey County is not exempt from these trends, and we lead the state, unfortunately, in some of the trends of child obesity, a greater problem in low-income and minority communities. So we're going to continue working on those issues. They do affect not only the health of our communities, but the economy of our communities as well. So I'll close on that note. I'll be glad to answer any questions, but perhaps after Assemblymember Stone's presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it. Next, we have Assemblymember Mark Stone of the 29th State Assembly District. Assemblymember Stone began his career as a trustee and later a board president of the Scotts Valley Unified School District. He continued his public service with 2 terms on the Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisors and served as a 2011 vice chair of the California Coastal Commission. In November 2012, Assemblymember Stone was elected to represent the 29th State Assembly District and assumed a position in the FORA Board of Directors. In his short time on the board, Assemblymember Stone has worked hand in hand with Senator Monning and Congressman Farr on the cemetery, economic recovery, and habitat conservation issues. Again, the cemetery would be nowhere where it is now without Assemblymember Stone's vital active interest and support on that, and we do appreciate all you've done on behalf of the veterans and of FORA. Sir, whatever you'd like.
Thank you. And I think from the higher level, I'd like to just put a few comments in about the water bond as well as the current state of the budget. What was very interesting, and I think of note, Senator Monning mentioned there was not a lot of great press coverage around the rainy day fund. And when it was first proposed to be talked about a few weeks ago, there was some of the normal sniping that was starting between the parties. But one of the things that I will point out is that once the deal was about to be struck, there was very little of that. It happened quickly, it happened across party lines, and it happened in both houses and the governor. That, I think, bespeaks a little different tone in Sacramento, an ability to get things done that hadn't been there before. Just wanted to point that out lest we underestimate the changes going on in Sacramento right now that I think are very, very favorable to being able to get things done. Now that, of course, will be on your ballot next year or this coming November. So that is something that I think everybody needs to take a look at, what that rainy day fund represents, because it's designed to smooth out the ups and downs of the economy over time, and I think it will do a good job of that. With respect to the water bond, again, sort of anecdotally, Senator and I have been working pretty closely in ensuring that whatever is coming out of that bond, we're able to take advantage of, because we certainly don't want Central Coast voters to be weighing on something that doesn't have direct benefit. So protection of watersheds, technologies, ability to work to pull monies out to solve our water problems, recognizing that all the water systems in the Central Coast are independent, not as well connected as they should be, and I think a lot of the projects to interconnect and be able to work better together, manage water regionally, will be more effective. That's where we're headed in the Central Coast, and I think that if we have items in the bond that we can draw down to help us with that will be very, very beneficial. The original polling showed that what's currently headed for election in 2014 would fail. It was about $11 billion, and they were looking 6 to 8 billion was the sweet spot before. Well, each of those bonds that's being talked about now is creeping up towards double digits, if not already over double digits. So while I am hopeful we will get something on the ballot and hopeful that voters in California will agree, because we absolutely need to get those resources in order to solve a lot of problems, I'm hopeful that we're not heading down the same path the previous bond did. In order to get a deal, added a lot of specific projects, answered questions for individual legislators in individual districts, and became a mess that the media pointed out was not something that they would support, and I think most voters turned away from. I'm hopeful we're not headed down that path, although we're sitting here right now, I'm not entirely convinced that we've overcome those challenges in the legislature. Much of the work that I'm doing still revolves around the human services areas. I have several bills that are not real sexy and headline grabbing, but are fundamental to the way the system works or doesn't in trying to improve the way information is gathered and shared in the foster care system, making sure the CalWorks and CalFresh programs like the EBT cards, the electronic benefits cards system works better for the recipients, much more efficient. There's a whole host of bills there. And I did want to call your attention to one bill that I have, and it's AB 2119. I noticed it's on your list as a bill to watch, so I just thought I'd pitch it a little bit. It's a county sales tax measure, just to make sure that we're clear, and if you came to support it, I would appreciate that. From my experience on the Board of Supervisors, that's where this comes from. Cities can pass their own sales tax rates, and I fully understand that sales taxes are not the best revenue mechanism we could be using. They tend to be a bit regressive, but since the legislature took away redevelopment, has taken away so many tools, it's one of the few tools that's left. Cities can pass a sales tax within their jurisdictions. If a county wants to pass a sales tax, it needs to be countywide, including the cities, and go to all of the voters in the county, including the cities. So they can't set up their own sales tax. In a lot of counties, especially the larger counties, virtually all the population lives in the cities, and it's not very much an issue. Monterey, Santa Cruz, a number of counties that have a tremendous amount of the population living in the unincorporated areas. This, to me, is a tool that counties have been asking for a while that would allow them to ask their voters to pass a sales tax from the county, the unincorporated residents, that would be effective only in the unincorporated areas, not involve the cities at all. And so far, the only opposition that's been raised from the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association is that if this passed, it would create confusion because there would be different sales tax rates across counties or within the counties because of all the cities. And I find that an interesting argument, since that's exactly the case we find ourselves in now, with different cities having different tax rates and the county having a different tax rate. So that opposition didn't make much sense to me. This would not be exacerbating it, but would give an additional tool to counties to be able to raise revenues for infrastructure projects that they have. And of course, they would still have to go out to their voters. That's what that bill is. And as you take that up and do consider it, any comments, criticism, support would be gratefully appreciated. I think that's the highlights of what I wanted to touch base on. I'm very happy to answer your question. It's been a productive year. I certainly appreciate the ability, I think we talked about this last year, being able to work with Senator Monning and represent the Central Coast. We've been able to coordinate very well on issues, not just FORA, but water bond, other areas of significance that are important, we know, to the Central Coast, and in a way that we carry a stronger voice in Sacramento. We each have our houses to work within, and being able to share that burden across the two houses has been, I think, very, very effective for the Central Coast. I appreciate your attention. I know you're just out of a long closed session and it's a warm afternoon, and we're both very happy to answer questions you might have.
Any member of the board have any questions? Yes, Victoria, you start off.
It's actually not a question. I wanted to thank both the senator and the assemblyman. This is news to me, and I'm still, believe it or not, still new to this a little bit, but I learned at a recent post-reassessment advisory committee, I was trying to get the acronym, PRAC, that the staff has been working on an idea of addressing our blight removal that would have statewide repercussions. Jane, you weren't there, but thanks to Jane and the staff for always trying to think creatively about things, different mechanisms. That was one of the four key impediments that the PRAC identified between the situation we're in now and full implementation of the base reuse plan. And so I understand you've been involved in discussions with the staff about that. I wanted to thank you in advance. I found it very interesting and innovative thinking, and thank you in advance for whatever you can do to keep us down that road. I know it's not a new idea to you all, but it was new to me, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill?
Yeah, I might just comment briefly on that. I met with Mayor Rubio this morning on the same issue, and clearly the key to development or restoration of habitat, whatever the planning objectives are, key to that is removing blight. And the problem is the huge cost and the funding mechanism being stalled by economic stall and lack of certain plan development, not manifesting into resources that can be used for that blight removal. You know, we're encouraged by the CSU commitment to investing around $30 million to blight removal, and are exploring how could there be partnerships if they're making that investment to gain some economies of scale to also take on non-CSU blight that's in the same area. I'll share with you what I shared with Ralph. We're willing to explore any and all options, creative funding mechanisms, bank loans on equity of existing properties, etc. But my one caution, and I just want to be candid and honest, as I said earlier, the state is in a fragile budget recovery, and I just want to dissuade people of thinking there's money sitting in the general fund waiting to be allocated to this project or to any similar ones around the state. That said, there could be, we are willing to explore and will be exploring possible partnerships where state resources could maybe back up a commercial loan or some other creative financing mechanism, or exploring qualifying for state bonds, something like that. But I think Mark would back me up in saying there's probably a low possibility of general fund revenues being allocated. The money we secured for the Veterans Cemetery, that type of success with general fund allocation is probably not likely to be repeated anytime soon. So anyway, just kind of a balanced reaction, but an enthusiastic one in terms of looking for those solutions.
Okay. Other questions by board members? Seeing none, out to the public. Any questions by members of the public for our two senior representatives?
Yvonne Stone, Executive Director of FORA Environmental Justice Network. I am glad to see our legislators here, and some of the comments about, especially when it comes to health, children's health, I'm really concerned that the toxic smoke from the burning that uses napalm is being burned, along with hundreds of tons of fire retardant. And the children here, along with the adults, are being greatly and gravely impacted in their health. And we don't seem to think that that's a problem. The Office of Health Hazards, the environmental impacts, they have put out a report concerning especially the health of minority children that are being impacted by toxins and contaminants that are affecting them, that have nothing to do with the way they live, the food they eat. And we need to take a look at how their health is being impacted that has nothing to do with the food that they buy from the store, the candy, or the sodas. So that is one of the concerns. The other concern is we have a community here that is very low income. We have people giving away a few clothes. Some people can get food, EBT cards. They're being charged for the cards. We have parents here that have children, that have babies, that are trying to go to school, trying to get an education. We have the greatest list of colleges and universities but the parents can't even concentrate on getting a decent education. I'm talking about from the local community here that have been greatly impacted by this base closure and by what is happening to their communities, to their families, to their friends, how they're being disenfranchised. And I know we can do better. I know because I've been working to do better all these years, to help the communities to do better, to educate our elected officials, to educate the people who are coming into the community that don't seem to know what's happening. This should not be a shadow project. This should be open. Our local officials, our government, all of that should be open. So I am standing here to tell you that somebody needs to man up. We need to do better for our community and for the people who live here. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Board. My name is Bill Carruthers. This is a tiny administrative detail. When it comes to public-private partnerships for blight removal, I'd simply like to meet with Mr. Monning after the meeting is over. I have several proposals I think he would find very interesting.
Thank you, sir. Next member of the public. Any other members of the public? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Malika Velasquez. I attended a community meeting in Seaside on Monday. It was a very personal meeting for me because I recently lost a friend that I grew up with, and well, we went to high school together in the month of April. He was shot dead on San Pablo, I believe, in Seaside. One of the things that disturbed me in that meeting was the ignoring of the fact that our kids are out here dying, people are being hurt, and the answer was, well, we can put more uniformed officers on the street. You know, we need the community to be more involved. It can't just be the police department. That was the response from the police department. But one of the things that's being ignored is the fact that it's going to keep happening unless you actually change the condition of the people. And I was a little shocked when I heard you, Mr. Monning, when you were saying in regards to the Blythe that you could look at creative financing for that. But when it comes to the fact that studies have shown our children are in the most danger of either being arrested, being impregnated, dying, or going to jail between the hours of 6 p.m. and 9 p.m., they have nothing to do. And in the summertime, that increases because they have nothing to do all day. I'm not hearing about any creative financing for that. And I really would like to, if someone can respond to that, as to why that's not happening when, you know, we can have money for the base cleanup, we can have money for blight removal, but when it comes to saving lives, you know, we hear from the police department, well, we have limited resources. Well, we need the community to be more involved. Where is the creative financing for that issue? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other members of the public wishing to address our senior elected representatives? Seeing none, public comment period is closed. Senator Monning, Assembly members, would you like to make any comments at this time with regard to the public comment?
Well, I'll start. I just appreciate the public being here and the opportunity to hear from the public as we do at regular town hall meetings and constituent meetings. I don't necessarily want to get into a dialogue on some of the specific points raised. I will say that my somewhat pessimistic view about any state funding for blight removal is in large measure due to how our budget is structured, and about 50% of the state budget goes into K through 12 and higher education, and about 30% to health and human services, which includes in-home support services, disability services, child care, Medi-Cal coverage, what we call our social safety net, and it's woefully inadequate. But it is part of the structure of our state budget and represents, behind education, the second largest allocation of our budget is invested into communities. I think the longer term conversation is to look and describe this California we want to live in, and do we want our educational system to be 50th? Because that contributes. If we don't invest in education, then we see people ending up in the criminal justice system. So the broader discussion is, what would we like our educational system to look like, our community investments, what would that price tag be, and what would be an equitable way to raise those revenues? Because we're, quite frankly, limited by the revenue that comes from personal income tax, sales tax, capital gains tax, and corporate tax, in that order. So for California to really move forward, we have to have that fundamental conversation at the community level, the state level, and the national level. But I do appreciate the input. It's important. And I don't know, Assemblymember Stone?
I do. Just to talk briefly about a bill that I'm trying to put through on outdoor education, and it would be a funding mechanism for underserved communities. There are a number of programs throughout the state that are struggling to be able to provide those kinds of opportunities for kids, and especially in the underserved areas, give them something to do, get them out to the beaches, to our state parks, and other places. We are struggling with funding mechanisms for it. Right now, that is one of the issues we're working on in the legislature, and again, trying to be creative to create a pool that then could fund programs like that. So there are a number of initiatives that are trying to be helpful from a state level, but then it takes local organizations to come up with the program itself. We're trying to backfill and make sure that there's some funding available.
Final comment.
Yes, sir.
There's a lot of challenges. I think it's important to underscore an evolving success, and that's the implementation of the Affordable Care Act in the state of California. Over 1 million folks who did not have health insurance, did not have access to primary care providers, as of today do. That system is not without some hurdles and some rough edges, but I would say California leads the nation in expanding health care to the uninsured, much of that supported by the federal government, but a lot of it shouldered by taxpayers in the state of California as well. But in terms of long-term public health trajectories, the investment in primary care, prevention, immunizations, health education is a piece of that broader campaign for public health. And I just think it's important to underscore that. There's been a lot of stakeholders working to make that successful at the local level. So thank you.
Okay, again, thank you to both of you gentlemen for all the work you do on behalf of the Central Coast. And also the work you do as the members of the board of directors here. You truly are in politics to make a difference for the good. We really appreciate all your work. Thanks. Now, as chair for the agenda, I'd like to make a slight change. We have under new business 10A, approved positions on current state legislation. Since we have our two senior legislators here, I'd like to move from 10A up right now and have Mr. Michael Hulamar discuss that while we have the representatives here. Michael?
Yes, Chair Edelin and members of the board, every year the Fort Ord Reuse Authority adopts a legislative agenda, typically in the month of November, sometimes in December, but always in time to be able to provide for our Senate, Assembly, and congressional offices, our legislative agenda for follow-up. Upon submitting those, oftentimes the legislators do produce legislative actions, sometimes bills that respond to the agenda from FORA, the county, and many others. We coordinate that effort with the county and TAMPC and our other colleagues so that we are at least consistent, not always in agreement, but at least consistent in the positions we take on efforts that have to do with the former Fort Ord. The legislative committee then meets throughout the year on individual legislative actions that are being moved forward in the legislature. In the state of California's case, there are a number of items that we have listed for your review, and in your packet we have several different pieces of legislation for your review. Most of those are in a position for a watch position. I think Assemblymember Stone's item on local taxes, the legislative committee had not heard fully about all of it. We may want to consider looking at that one in a different position today, but I want to move on to the next
list where we talk about those that we have for support. There are 3 items that the Legislative Committee is recommending for support. One is the Speaker's AB 2176, which would allow GoBiz, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, to recommend an economic development strategic plan for the state. In the past, GoBiz had this as an option, but it really wasn't authorized to take the actions, and so the speakers moved this ahead to continue to support the GoBiz effort. Assemblymember Alejo has a specific request to establish CRIAs, or Community Revitalization Investment Authorities. Today you heard from some speakers about the concern for disadvantaged communities, in particular the very low-income communities. This is a vehicle that would replace the lost tool of redevelopment for the very worst communities and have them allow them to be able to reuse and redevelop in their communities. And the members of the Legislative Committee thought that since the focus here is benefiting our very poorest communities, that this would be a very good way to go, and certainly there are pockets within former Fort Ord that also qualify for this same benefit. So the jurisdictions could use those tools. And then finally, Senator Monning mentioned earlier his SB 936, and the Legislative Committee is asking the board to agree with their endorsement of that bill. Chair, that's all I have.
Any questions by members of the board? Saying none, out to the public. Any questions by members of the public? Saying none, back to the board. I entertain a motion, please.
Chair, I move approval of recommendations from the Legislative Committee.
Okay, as published, or any changes?
With respect to 2119?
2119, do you want to consider moving from a watch to a support position?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a motion to approve the staff recommendations with the exception of moving 2119 from a watch to a support position. Do I have a second?
Second.
We have a second. We have a motion from Mayor Pro Tem Oglesby and second by Supervisor Parker. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anybody opposed? Motion carries unanimously. That's a good start for this meeting. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, anytime. Okay, next we have the acknowledgments, announcements, and correspondence. We will start off with presenting a resolution to Mayor Bill Camp for his outstanding service. Before I read this resolution, I'd just like to make a comment. I've had a chance to work with Bill for a number of years now. What people don't realize, I guess a lot of you don't, Bill Camp is a mayor of a non-land use jurisdiction. Pacific Grove really doesn't border FORA whatsoever. He's working here purely as a professional, volunteered to come on here and do some work, and work he's done. He's probably worked harder than any other member of this board, and especially as a non-land use jurisdiction. It's incredible. He was our Preston Park negotiator for years, and the Preston Park negotiations, I guess if you're familiar with those, are downright bloody, knockdown, drag out, you name it. But he's cool, calm, intelligent. In fact, I was talking about intelligence. I'm not very impressed by where people go to school. It doesn't really matter to me. Bill got his bachelor's and master's degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is probably one of the top schools in the country. That doesn't really impress me. But what has impressed me is dealing with him in closed session in a lot of negotiations. I've been in politics now going on 15, almost 20 years. I've never had so many intelligent comments, so incisive, of pulling things together, of pulling something out that who in the heck would have thought of something like that? And I asked him one time, and I said, Bill, how did you come up with that? He goes, well, I had a professor that said this, and I put it together with a professor that said that, and he's able to synthesize more in an intellectual basis than anybody I've ever known. So plus I've worked with Bill on the revamping all the financial reimbursement procedures for FORA, since we had some issues earlier on. And when he goes and works on something, he works on it 1,000%. So it's been a real honor, Bill, for me. Let me read this to you. It was put together by the staff with the board input. Florida Reefs Authority Resolution of Appreciation. I can do it. The resolution is adopted with reference to the following facts and circumstances. Whereas Bill Camp was elected to the Pacific Grove City Council in 2008 and ascended to his mayoral post in 2012. Concurrently appointed to the Florida Reefs Authority Board of Directors, serving continuously, tirelessly, and commendably for the last 5 years. Whereas Mayor Camp served with extraordinary distinction as an Authority Finance Committee member from 2011 to 2012, as chair of the Finance Committee from 2012 to 2014, offering indispensable input and valued coordination with staff. And whereas during his tenure as Finance Committee chair, Mayor Camp oversaw selection work of the authority's external audits, instigated the enhancement of the authority expense policies, effectively directed the budgeting process, strengthening the authority's financial stability. And whereas Bill Camp has served as chair of the Preston Park Negotiating Committee, offering sage advice, regional perspective to this key economic item. And whereas Mayor Camp has steadfastly supported the Monterey Bay's military community partnerships, has been an active advocate for a comprehensive regional approach to critical water infrastructure, public works, and public safety issues. And whereas the Florida Reefs Authority has benefited in extraordinary ways from Bill Camp's laudable patience and noteworthy diplomacy in both apprehending acronyms and navigating the bureaucratic cloud that hovers over the former economic recovery activities. And whereas Mayor Camp has consistently sought regional solutions to the political, socioeconomic, and environmental issues facing the Monterey Bay community, and now there be it resolved for all the supporting notation cited above, but not limited to thereto, the Florida Reefs Authority Board of Directors hereby expresses its sincere commendation to Mayor Bill Camp. Be it further resolved on behalf of all Florida Reefs Authority jurisdictions and staff, the Board of Directors extends its gracious appreciation and deepest gratitude to Bill Camp for his leadership of Pacific Grove and exemplary service to the Monterey Bay region. Passed and adopted by the Florida Reuse Authority Board of Directors is 11th of April, 2014. Bill, thank you for all the work you've done.
First, in the short thing is thank you for your overly kind words. I just want to say it is a privilege, and as an alternate, I consider it a continuing privilege to be able to work with such an incredible assembly of people who are so committed to serving this region with such distinction. I learn a lot from it, take a lot of emotional support from the kind of dynamics we have. Thank you.
I was going to do this from the seat, but I've been told otherwise. On April 25th, last month, Executive Officer Michael Hulamart and I were invited to the National League of United Latin American Citizens dinner, basically. And I'm sorry? Yeah, it's basically, they called it the Day of Remembrance. And they had all the major players from the LULAC that were there, and they presented a plaque to the board of directors and the staff of FORA for all the work that FORA has done on behalf of the Veteran Cemetery and also just general veterans issues. They were very, very complimentary, very gracious, and we had basically Mr. Carlos Ramos, who's normally here. I'm not sure why he's not here today. He's here almost every meeting. Very articulate, probably one of the most articulate speakers I've heard in years. Was a master of ceremonies, did a great job there. They had national representatives there and so forth. And FORA was highlighted for all the work we've done in helping the veterans out. So I just wanted to show the plaque here to everybody. And I just want to express officially the FORA board and staff thanks to LULAC for their recognition of the efforts. And the efforts will continue, and we will support the veterans 1,000%, not just 100%. Thank you. Okay, next, any other acknowledgements, Michael?
No, sir.
Okay. Next, we have the consent agenda. You've got the consent agenda on your packet. Any member of the board wishing to pull any of the items on the consent agenda for discussion or questions? Seeing none, out to the public. Any member of the public wishing to pull the consent agenda for any items, for any discussion or questions about the items? Seeing none, back to the board. I'd entertain a motion, please.
Move to approve consent agenda.
Okay, we have Councilman Dennis Alexander who's making the motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
And second with Mayor Camp. Any discussion? All in favor signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. Okay. Next we go to old business, approve resolution requesting Preston Park loan extension. Michael?
Yes, Chair Edel and members of the board, the Fort Ord Reuse Authority acquired the Preston Park Complex in the year 2000. That was after having leased the Preston Park Complex and the Abrams Park Complex in the city of Marina from 1997 through the year 2000. After that time, FORA and Marina operated the property and continue to operate that property as a rental, with a number of the units provided for low-income and moderate-income families. The loan that we currently have before you to consider is a loan that was taken out 5 years ago. That was a loan that consolidated 3 other loans on this property that paid for the improvements along Imgen Parkway, 2nd Avenue, also provided some funding for parks in the Preston Park area, and also provided matching funds for the General Jim Moore project, along with the pollution legal liability insurance policy. So we funded this loan to consolidate all of that and put it into a single one solid financing. That loan matures on June 15th and needs to be extended, since we are currently in litigation which prevents us from selling the property to pay off the remaining $18 million. So we are asking the board to allow that loan to continue through December 15th, 2014. The appraisal charges and other closing costs would be borne by FORA, and some of the terms of the previous loan will not continue, such as the swap contract will not continue. But the terms of the loan are there, 5.98% per annum, with the extension fee not to exceed 25 basis points. Chair Edel, that's my report.
Any questions by members of the board of directors? Yes, Supervisor Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just 2 questions for clarification. Could you remind me why this is under old business? I think I could probably guess, but I think the discussion of the loan extension is a new topic to the public. And then also the other question I had was, could you just clarify why the 6-month extension and why we think we're going to be in a better position in December than we are now in terms of the repayment of the loan?
Sure. Staff wrestled with the same question you had about whether this was new or old, and after talking it through with counsel, everyone else, we thought that the public would best be informed by the idea we're extending an existing loan. The board has taken actions on this loan. It's not a brand new loan, and the board has taken action in this regard several times. So we thought it was old business in that regard. With respect to
the 6-month, why do we think 6 months is enough time?
December 15th, 180 days was at the direction of Rabobank, who happens to be the lender. They indicated that that was the maximum they were prepared to do at this time, and working with counsels, we thought that that would allow for sufficient time for the litigation to be addressed.
Other questions by board members?
Yes.
Yes, Mayor Gunter.
What happens if this doesn't resolve itself by December the 15th? I think the public needs to be aware of what happens then.
It depends on what the status would be at December 15th. If, in fact, it is not resolved and still in court, it would probably be a judicial direction. If it, we would probably not be allowed to, the loan would not be allowed to be called if we are still in a legal wrestling at that point. It really would depend on if an action had been taken and is pending. It might also be that a legal action might be in negotiation. So it really would depend on the status we're in December 15th. It is possible that the lender could choose to call the loan on December 15th. That would definitely put us in court, I believe.
Thank you.
Other questions by board members? Yes. Mayor Camp.
I'm noticing the absence of our representatives from Marina. And the source of contention has roots in kind of divergences. And in looking at this action without the voice of Marina as part of it, are we really achieving what we need to achieve in this extension?
I can address that in the only way I know how, and then ask for authority counsel to assist me. The bank did indicate that the parties had to be unanimous in their agreement about on this issue, given that the loan matures on June 15th, and they need to have a way to address their collateral on this property. We do think the City of Marina would want this extension, but I would ask authority counsel to respond.
Mayor Camp, I think you raise a good point. That their absence is conspicuous. The loan and their absence certainly is telling. They did vote in favor of the loan. Both representatives voted in favor of the loan when it first was raised, and the fact that they're not here will not necessarily affect the board action, although I'm sure that had they participated one way or the other, it would have had some effect on their ability to argue within the litigation one way or the other. Had they voted against the extension, that would have had an effect. Had they voted in favor of it, that would have had an effect. So they're obviously neither the two representatives nor their alternates are here, and I think that's unfortunate.
Other questions by board members? Yes.
Hi. Just to
Councilwoman
follow up
Beach.
on this exchange here. So, Council, you were saying that they voted on the loan. Did you mean the extension of the loan, or what?
No.
What vote are you referring to?
The loan that occurred at the inception of the loan.
The 5-year consolidation.
Correct.
Okay. And then I had one other question, maybe for staff. So the 25, not to exceed 25 basis points fee, is that the only cost of extension? And I would just ask if you understand the comparison between what the cost would be if we were just in a moment of refinancing, for example. This is an extension of an existing loan versus a opportunity to refinance or do whatever. What is it? Just the basis points that we're suffering from as a result of this action?
We are also required by the bank. The bank's required, and therefore we're required to pay for the cost of an appraisal, updating the value of the property. So that's additional cost. I don't think that is a major cost. It is thousands, single-digit thousands, I would assume, $7,000, $8,000. I'm not positive, but it'd be in that range. So in addition to the 25 basis points, there is the cost of the appraisal. And this fixed rate cost is slightly above the interest rate that we have before, so that might be considered a minor cost. If we were refinancing, we would be doing all of that same work, and I'm not sure what rate we would get, although there are some fairly preferential rates out there for new loans with valid collateral.
So the only reason I bring it up is that it seems to me this is sort of a cost of our ongoing litigation, and it might be something we would consider trying to recover at some point as damages or something.
I think that that is absolutely within the litigation that should FORA have to expend monies, which they will. It's clearly caused by the action, by the lawsuit, and it would be an element of our ultimate damage within the lawsuit.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions by board members? Yes, Mayor Gunter.
This is our loan, is my understanding. So Marina has no, they wouldn't be punished by us allowing this to go to foreclosure. Just FORA would, and it would damage FORA's credit. Is that my understanding?
It may damage both of our credit, but certainly it would damage FORA's if it went to foreclosure.
Okay.
Any other questions by board members? Okay, out to the public. Any questions by members of the public?
I'm Margaret Davis, speaking as a resident of Marina, and I must say that the whole presentation of this hurried rush seems extremely shabby and manipulative, and has the added benefit of bullying Marina and putting them in an untenable position. You had many months to deal with this. You could see it coming, and yet it's shoved through at the last minute. There's the claim that the bank requires unanimous vote. I didn't see support for that claim in the packet, and I would like to know, as a resident of Marina, what is the explanation for that? Who negotiated? Who introduced that into the negotiations? It just seems very disadvantageous to Marina. Obviously, Marina is not going to want to participate with this or be on record because of the lawsuit. So it includes Marina out. And there's an opportunistic inclusion also of this hyper-defensive item providing cover to FORA and especially to the top staff. Further, be it resolved that any and all acts previously taken by Mr. Hulamard and the authority in furtherance of and consistent with the actions authorized under these resolutions are hereby ratified. You could hardly expect Marina to have voted favorably on that. FORA seems to continue a pattern of uncivil and unfair treatment to Marina and defensiveness towards staff as a top priority and politicizing all possible opportunities.
Thank you, ma'am. Next public speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Board. Michael Salerno. I'm speaking strictly as a member of, or excuse me, strictly as a resident of Marina today. I'd like to back up Jane Parker's comment that I don't believe this is old business. I haven't seen the item of the extension in front of the public yet. Secondly, I'd agree with Ms. Davis that there's been plenty of time for this to be fleshed out in public meetings. This feels like a last-minute rush. It's an $18 million roughly left on the loan, and we're under 30 days, and we're looking for some kind of action. Now it's last minute. Should have been done earlier. In regards to what Rabobank is looking for, there's no indication in the board packet that Rabobank is actually looking for a unanimous vote here, or what their other conditions actually are. That would have been very helpful documentation for the public to see. The representatives from my city are not here. I can only assume they've been given guidance in some direction not to be here, which is unfortunate, but I think what's going on here, it feels like a political hammer, because if Preston Park were allowed to go into foreclosure, it would certainly damage Marina in that they'd be losing an asset and the future revenue from that asset. I also think it's worth exploring further. I know there's no time, but it would have been nice to have a more detailed presentation as to actually what would happen if this property went into foreclosure. In other words, would Rabobank actually take it over? How interested are they in the property? It's got a nice cash flow, so maybe they want it. So everybody loses. I don't know. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other public comment about this item? Saying none, public comment period's closed. We have Mr. Chris Reynolds here from Rabobank, who's basically fully knowledgeable about the loan. Mr. Reynolds, would you like to answer some of the questions about the loan that were raised by the two public speakers?
No, but I will.
Smart man.
The question was raised whether or not the bank was requiring, or somebody else was requiring, a unanimous vote, and the answer was yes. The bank did require that, and the reason for it is that there was some concern that the bank might be facing a litigious city, namely Marina. There's been some suggestion that they tend to not always act consistently and file lawsuits that could have been avoided. So if they were to vote with the rest of the board in favor of this resolution, if that's what the board chooses to do, that would be one less likely cause of a future lawsuit, and so that was the reason for it. I was asked before this meeting, in fact 2 weeks ago, whether or not if the board were to support it and Marina didn't, what would the bank do? And I couldn't answer that because it would be up to the credit committee of the bank. So that's the answer to those questions.
Thank you, sir. Okay, back to the board. I would entertain a motion. Mayor Pro Tem Oglesby.
I move the extension of the loan.
Okay, we have a motion.
Request.
Second.
And we have a second by Councilmember Alexander. Any discussion on the motion?
On the second.
I'm sorry?
On the second.
Okay.
I wasn't going to say too much, but I'm going to say a little bit. If the representatives from Marina would have thought this was a bad enough idea, they would have been here to put their objections on the table. And for them to leave their constituents in the bind about what side of the discussion they're on, I think that's the disservice. We all know that it's in their benefit to extend this loan, but they don't want to be on record to extend it by either being here, voting yes, or by abstention. And so politically, right, they're not in the room, and that's okay. But it's just a disservice for them to lead them down here and not let them know that this is a good thing. All right.
Any other discussion on the motion?
Yes.
Mayor Gunter.
I've been toying with the idea of voting no, except for after listening to the arguments and listening to the fact that this would damage FORA and it would cause great harm to a lot of good communities. And I am dissatisfied with the fact that the Marina representatives didn't have the courage to come forward today and explain whether they were going to vote yes or no, and to stand up and to represent their communities is rather disheartening, because as elected officials, that's their responsibilities. Two of these people are attorneys, and they should take on their responsibilities seriously. I'm almost ashamed to sit on a board with people that don't have the courage to do what's right. They have brought this action. They have caused us a lot of grief and money spending. But this involves more than just my personal feelings. So I just think that it should be known that I'm really disappointed that people don't have the courage to hold to their convictions after standing up and holding this board, as I said earlier, as hostages by their litigious actions and the fact that they want to push us to the limit. Well, the limit's here now.
Thank you, Mayor.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Supervisor Parker.
Sorry, just to go back, Mr. Reynolds answered one of the questions that was raised by the public, but another question that was raised was whether Rabobank considers this to be an attractive property that they would foreclose on. I don't know if Mr. Reynolds would like to speak
We'll
to
ask
that.
him. Mr. Reynolds, would you like to answer that question, please?
He probably doesn't want to, but it might be good if he would.
He's being paid by the hour. Not really.
He wishes he were. To answer the question about the foreclosure, what the bank would do is laid out very clearly in the loan documents, which are voluminous. And the way it works is that if there is a default, they would file a notice of default, which means that within 120 days, a foreclosure could happen. So if that process got started, it would be up to the parties to resolve it. Anytime during the 120 days or so in question, a payoff of the loan could take place, and it could take place perhaps from a sale of the property if it could be sold. the current inability to get title insurance probably means it could not be sold. For the same reason, it's unlikely that they could get a loan anywhere else. So the bank would take steps to protect its collateral, for sure. The bank very much does not want to foreclose. That's not what banks do, and banks tend to avoid that to the greatest extent they can, including our bank. So it is our strong preference that it not be foreclosed, but the bank will act to protect its collateral. That's a lot of money for depositors that needs to be protected. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the situation now.
Thank you. And the reason that if it were to go into foreclosure, that resolution couldn't be reached within the 120 days is because of the lawsuit, and we're in court still trying to work out details. So there's a cloud over the whole transaction. Is that?
Well, that's certainly true. Yes, there is.
Thank you.
Yeah. I will say, parenthetically, this is not in response to your question, though, that because there's FORA's loan and not, as one of your members here has said, the loan of the city of Marina, it is FORA's credit that probably gets damaged, even though it was actions by Marina that might have caused that damage to take place if it ever gets to that point. So, I mean, the board might well be better off getting an extension so that there is time to work this out without having to file notices of foreclosure or default and otherwise risk the possibility of a future foreclosure.
Thank you again, Mr. Reynolds. Any other discussion on the motion on the floor? Okay, seeing none, call for the question. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Anybody opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much, board. Appreciate it. Okay, next we have for new business, we've already done 10A. We're going to 10B, fiscal year 2014-15 capital improvement program. Michael?
Yes, Chair Edelin and members of the board, this presentation will be conducted by Jonathan Garcia, who is pinch hitting for Steve Ensley, who's elected to be in Italy this week. So Jonathan, I know, will do an extraordinary job. He will be ably assisted by our colleagues from the economic and planning systems. In particular, David Sender will do a presentation that outlines where he is on the phase 3 of our study. The capital improvement program has a history that goes all the way back to the middle of the 1990s, and in fact is specifically called out in the state legislation that created the Fort Ord Reuse Authority. And I remind the members of the board that because in following the state legislation that was just extended by work of Senator Manning in 2012, the Fort Ord Reuse Authority is to establish a capital facilities program. That capital facilities program took the form of a public facilities improvement program in 1996, and then that was adopted as a component of the base reuse plan in 1997. I think Jim Arnold might want to assist me in this. I believe, Jim, that was the basis for the year 2000 capital improvement program that was created. That capital improvement program was shared with others around the county, and it formed the basis for others to do similar kinds of capital improvement programs. This board reviews that CIP every year, updating and modifying to make adjustments for completions that are undertaken and to look into programming for future work that completes both our on-base mitigation requirements and our on-base building removal requirements and other requirements that are capital in nature. Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Edelin and members of the board. I'll have a brief overview presentation of the CIP today, and then I'll hand it off to David Zender and Ellen Martin from EPS to talk about the CFD fee, development fee formula calculation that they've performed as part of this item as well. So thanks to Michael's overview, he mentioned about the genesis of the CIP coming from the base use plan, and actually it coincided with the CIPs coincided with the Army FORA EDC agreement, where the Army agreed to transfer lands to FORA, and thereby having ensuring the redevelopment of reuse of former Fort Ord, and having those Army lands to build a new community on former Fort Ord. So just to go over various aspects of the capital improvement program. This is the largest program that FORA has as far as funding and expenditures. And I'll go over some of the basis for the CEQA mitigations and the non-CEQA mitigations. So first, the base use plan described the transportation and transit obligations. And basically, when the Army left the base, there were existing impacts, existing transportation going from Salinas Valley to the Monterey Peninsula and vice versa. And Fort Ord was relatively an island with outdated infrastructure for transportation. So the CIP develops that infrastructure to take on those existing impacts of traffic flows and then future impacts generated by development on former Fort Ord. For habitat management, the base use plan identified those impacts as well, and the HCP is what's been identified as a mitigation for those impacts, and it would allow implementation of the Army's habitat management plan and impacts for development. For water augmentation, the base use plan identified that there would have to be reclaimed water sources, augmented water sources for development on former Fort Ord. So that's been identified as a non-potable source, and FORA's CIP has held dollars in that to fund that program as well. Under storm drainage impacts, FORA received a grant and retired that obligation, I believe, in 2005. So that has been achieved already. But essentially, as development proceeds, storm drainage will be retained on site through drainage facilities in the new development on Fort Ord. And on firefighting enhancement, FORA has retired this obligation this fiscal year, and that was a purchase of fire vehicles to the major firefighting agencies around the former Fort Ord. And at this point, the titles of those vehicles have transferred over to those agencies. Now, those were all the CEQA-generated mitigations in the CIP. Now, government code that created FORA also had something called a base-wide facility, which when the board could identify an important project that went beyond any single jurisdiction, the board would incorporate a base-wide facility. And these are non-CEQA base-wide facilities in FORA CIP. Currently, there are two: the building removal program and the property management caretaker costs. In previous CIPs, we've also had the MCWD voluntary contribution, but that is a change in this year's CIP. And just to look at briefly our funding sources for the capital improvement program, historically, grants have been a major funding source, as well as loans, as we talked on the previous item before the board tonight. But there are three major components, and this will come into play when EPS goes into more detail on their analysis. Primarily the CFD fee, the land sales proceeds, and the property tax funds are the main components of looking at FORA's funding sources for CIP. And just a quick look at where we've been so far with analyses and the FORA fee itself. So previously in 2011, EPS performed a phase 1 review of FORA CIP, consolidated a number of contingencies, and it resulted in a recommended 27% fee reduction. Then, since that occurred, the FORA board adopted a formula, and last year they adopted a recommended 23.6% fee reduction. And this year, just to give a little preview of EPS's recommendation, it was a 17.1% reduction, and it's primarily based on removing the MCWD voluntary contribution out of the CIP, since MCWD is picking that up in their own capacity charge. Just a review of how many committee meetings we've had recently. This doesn't include all of the administrative committee meetings, but just a review of where we've been so far. In February, the administrative committee reported on the jurisdiction's updated development projections, and then also recommended a different approach to the forecasting methodology. I included looking at differentiating between entitled and planned projects. So an entitled project is approved under CEQA is ready to be built and has permits in hand from a local jurisdiction. A planned project is one that hasn't gone through that same planning process. So to differentiate between that on our CIP will help with programming funds in the future. We've also had a workshop with the Administrative Committee in March and adopted this new forecasting methodology, and it's now described in the CIP document, and that was in April. And then just most recently, the Administrative Committee reviewed this CIP document. So a quick look at the road ahead. This won't come into play this year as much, but just to describe the post-FORA implications. These are responsibilities that would survive FORA's sunset. It would include Habitat Conservation Plan endowment. Currently shown in our CIP, we've collected $6 million to date, but we expect that total cost of the endowment to be around $40 million. So if that is not fully funded by the time FORA sunsets in 2020, that would be an obligation post-FORA. The base use plan compliance, the other CEQA mitigations, including the transportation and the water augmentation program contributions, if those aren't fully funded by 2020, those would be other responsibilities that survive FORA. Building removal may actually be accomplished by the end of FORA's life, but that's still incomplete at this point. And then the water purveyor service agreement, augmentation program allocations, etc. MCWD is currently working through a proposed annexation of the Fort Ord service area. So if that occurs before 2020, that might be resolved as well. And just different options that have been looked at the past to perform these post-FORA obligations. We've looked at the possibility of assigning responsibilities to an existing agency, responsibilities turning those over to the jurisdictions, creating a new JPA or modifying an existing joint powers authority, or creating a FORA shell that might maintain the funding structure, such as the CFD, property taxes, and land sale into the future. But all of these we'll look into in more detail as we get closer to that 2018 deadline for a dissolution plan for FORA. And just a quick overview of what remains on the transportation transit obligations. This slide is just to list what's the different projects that is in FORA's CIP, the on-site, the off-site, the regional, and the transit. For the on-site projects, FORA is lead agency on the top 4 of those. These include Eastside Parkway, South Boundary Road, Giggling Road, and Inner Garrison Road. The remaining ones on this slide are either part of reimbursement agreements or would likely be just FORA's transfer of funds to these other agencies that would be lead agency on building these road projects. And then also for the transit projects, financial contributions that FORA provides to MST for buses and intermodal centers, etc. Just a quick overview of what the MCWD water augmentation program had looked like before and where it may be going in the future. So previously, the MCWD board approved a RUOP, a Regional Urban Water Augmentation Program, in October 2004. The FORA board and MCWD board had a joint meeting in June 2005, and they adopted a hybrid alternative that was half reclaimed and half desalinated water. That project would produce, I think, at 3,000 acre feet was planned. Then MCWD also approved 2 addenda to that EIR, specifying the amounts for the reclaimed water portion. Just to note that the FORA CIP has $24 million programmed for that augmented water program, and currently MCWD is going to provide alternatives or show their direction for moving forward at a future FORA board meeting. So just noting that at the current status. So just to look at our current requested action today, so the board's to receive this presentation on the FORA CIP, receive EPS's results on their analysis, and then the request is to get direction on the CIP and on the resolution that would implement EPS's results on their analysis of the fees. So I'll hand this off for questions or hand it off to David to complete the his presentation and take questions at the end.
Let's take questions at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon, Chair Elan, members of the board. My name is David Zender. I'm Managing Principal of Economic and Planning Systems from the Sacramento office, and it's good to see this group again. So today we're going to take you through the results of our Phase 3 Capital Improvement Program review. Next slide, please. And this overview will include, we're going to touch on the formulaic approach that Jonathan alluded to a bit earlier, talk a little bit about the review process that we've undertaken, tell you about the results of that process, and then get into a few of the key issues and sensitivity analyses that we focused on in particular as we went through the process, and then we can turn it over to Q&A. So as many of you probably recall, we went through a concerted effort last year to hammer out an approach to make this annual process much more predictable, robust, and stable. And we think that we have now moved past discussions of how the formula should be calculated, and we're now focusing on really how to treat individual circumstances and to look at different elements of costs that go into the CIP. But just a quick overview of the formulaic approach. As I mentioned, the purpose of using this formula is to provide a more predictable methodology for adjusting the policy and CFD special tax, otherwise known as the FORA fee. And the key features are we really calibrate existing financing tools. It's a defined, transparent, predictable process. It's fair and equitable and proportional. And the key to this all is fiscally prudent adjustments that limit FORA and member jurisdictions' risk. The formulaic approach, next slide, is following a 5-step process. Initially, what we do is we estimate the remaining costs confronting FORA as it goes into the future. From that, we deduct the available funding that we can account for at this time. We deduct then the remaining costs to arrive at net costs going forward. And then we compare those net costs to the fee revenue that would be generated under the current fee rate. And as necessary, we adjust the fee rate in order to come up with a overall rate that matches, that generates the appropriate amount of funding to cover the estimated costs. So I'm going to start with the overall conclusion, and then we can get into some of the more details. But as you can see, what we're suggesting at this time is that a 17.1% reduction would be an appropriate adjustment to bring the costs into balance with available revenues going forward. This would have the effect of reducing the FORA fee applied to new residential development on a per unit basis from about $27,180 to $22,530. All of the other land use categories would follow the same percentage change reduction. This gives you a little bit of detail behind the individual line items in the CIP and the amounts that are currently shown in this analysis. So as you can see, there are a couple things that have changed from previous analysis. I'm going to call those out briefly, and then we're going to come back and have a little bit more of a detailed discussion of some of the more important changes. The first thing that you'll notice is the water augmentation voluntary contribution has been removed from the CIP. That was formerly a bit over $20 million. In our review and discussions with MCWD and FORA staff and the development community in the lead up to this presentation, we've determined that that voluntary contribution is really redundant with the MCWD rate analysis and the capacity charges that they have presented in their most recent documentation. So it's our recommendation not to be duplicative with the MCWD capacity charge, and we have an opportunity now to bring that, to essentially move that responsibility over to MCWD on a permanent basis, and that provides a lower CIP for FORA. In addition, you'll see that the fire costs, go back there, Jonathan. Fire costs have been retired. Utility and storm obligations are no longer applicable. And the pollution liability insurance is embedded in the land sale, and we expect ESCA funds to partially offset those costs. So there's been a number of adjustments here to bring the overall costs down. As you can see, there are a couple of line items that remain in the budget. The Preston Park outstanding loan amount shows up. And then there is an advance against the CIP that is requiring payback for CIP applications in the future. And that's consistent with previous versions of this analysis. Here you can see the detailed results of the funding analysis, looking at the funding that's estimated to be available as we go forward. And you can see that we have an existing fund balance for the HCP endowment, just over $6 million. We have FORA property tax revenues estimated at $11.2 million, and land sale revenues estimated at $67.7 million. And as you'll recall, there's a very specific formula that goes into the estimate of the property tax revenues and land sale revenue line items. I'd be happy to cover that in more detail as part of the Q&A if we need a refresher on those. So here you can see the overall results. This is probably the critical table of the entire presentation. You can see that total costs are currently at $247.5 million. Our estimated total sources of funds are about $84.9 million. That means we need about $162.5 million in CFD special tax revenue generated through the FORA fee in order to meet our obligations going forward. If we were to apply the existing FORA fee rate going forward over the lifetime of FORA, the estimated amount that we would generate is $195.9 million. So you can see that our rates are currently a bit high relative to our need. The need, of course, is $162.5 million, which is the net cost that we alluded to earlier. And so really what the bottom line is this allows us to reduce the special tax generation by about 17.1%, or in other words, to basically bring down the overall revenue that would be generated to 82.9% of the current fee. So there are a number of key issues, things that we looked at in particular detail as we went through the process, and those are the MCWD voluntary water contribution, the HCP endowment payout rate and contingency, and the transportation costs and contingencies. Okay. So we can see we have the MCWD voluntary water contribution. This was discussed in some detail with the administrative committee, and we had a good dialogue with the administrative committee. I think there was widespread buy-in to the approach of not duplicating the capacity charge that MCWD is going to be carrying forward. But there was interest in just looking at the percentage increase if we were to put it back into the FORA budget. And so we've done that. You can see that by adding back in the $21.7 million voluntary water contribution, and I should add that this is a non-CEQA related water contribution, essentially originally anticipated to account for the capacity charge to ensure that that was covered. Now we can see that that's not the case, but if we were to add that back in, it would take our recommended adjusted fee up 11.1% from the suggested amount that we're recommending. Second is the HCP endowment, and the payout rate sensitivity is really the key thing that we're looking at in this case. So there are really three scenarios that we're studying in this case. The first, and this is the base case, is that there's a 4.5% payout. This scenario basically is reflecting a situation where we go out to market and we hire a financial manager and we look at investment vehicles. The financial manager would select various investment vehicles and obtain the highest payout rate possible from the endowment. In that case, we are looking at something like a 20.3 million HCP contingency, bringing the total HCP funding obligation to 60.4 million. And that is the base case scenario. There is some uncertainty in that scenario. The payout rates or the returns from the investment, because we are going out to the private market in that scenario, would be somewhat variable. So that is the reason for including a contingency in that case. The second scenario is a 3.5% payout. This reflects a guaranteed payout because we would be going to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, otherwise known as NFWF. And the guaranteed payout at 3.5% then allows us to eliminate the contingency altogether. The caveat there is no agreement in place at this time to allow that to occur. So it would be a bit premature to make that assumption. If that were all to transpire and as shown, then we would be able to eliminate the contingency, and that would result in a 5.8% reduction from our current recommendation. The third scenario is the least optimistic in terms of payout rates. This would be essentially going to California Fish and Wildlife. Their guaranteed rate is 2%. However, just running a 2% plays havoc with our cash flow, and in fact, we would need all of the contingency that we've identified, and we would need to bump up the FORA fee in order to capitalize the endowment fund and keep the HCP endowment solvent. So that would be the most draconian version. That would increase the fee if we were to go that direction by 3.8% over current recommendations. Third topic that we looked at is transportation cost contingency. We did a sensitivity analysis of this. And the current approach is to apply a 15% contingency across all transportation costs, whether those are projects that are led by FORA or led by TAMC. The suggested sensitivity would be to just apply the contingency of 15% only to the FORA-led transportation costs. Those costs are approximately $33.7 million of the $118.8 million transportation project budget. The concern is that we don't have complete certainty over the transportation cost amount at this time. And so the recommendation is based on a need to be somewhat conservative and only make this type of adjustment once we have a much better handle on all of the costs in the transportation budget going forward, and the opportunity to really review the contingencies that are appropriate given our level of certainty about those costs. If we were to go with that adjustment of just applying these to the FORA-led projects, that would reduce the FORA fee by 6.4% relative to our recommendation. So this table rolls it all up, and you can see the sum total of the different sensitivities we've looked at compared to the base case. So the base case, as I mentioned earlier, results in a 17.1% overall reduction to the FORA fee. The resulting single-family fee rate would be $22,530. And then you can see to the right the different sensitivity analysis results. Again, the MCWD voluntary water contribution, if we put that back in, the fee jumps back up to $25,500. If we are to assume a 3.5% payout on the HCP endowment, and reduce the contingency, that would take the single-family rate to about $21,000. But remember, we do not have an agreement yet with NFWF that would allow that to occur. And then finally, the FORA transportation contingency, if we were to apply the 15% only to FORA-led transportation projects, we would be down to $20,800. Again, we believe that it makes sense to be somewhat conservative. So our recommendation is to go with the base case, 17.1% developer fee reduction, and maintain the contingencies we've identified until there's an adopted HCP, including a JPA that's formed around that. And also we have an HCP endowment holder and payout rate determined. And then finally, we believe we need to also dot our I's, cross our T's on the variable transportation costs, and ensure that our contingencies are in line with our level of certainty around those costs. So that brings me to the conclusion of this presentation, and we're happy to take questions at this point.
Michael,
and by the way, I wanted to also introduce my colleague Ellen Martin. Ellen is really a key person in this analysis and has done a great job of putting these numbers together and working with Jonathan and the development community and so forth. And I wanted to also mention we have had 2 meetings with the development community to go over these results and these analyses, and those have been very productive, I believe. Thank you.
So you brought the brains behind the organization. Is that what you're saying?
You bet.
Okay, thank you. Michael, you had a few comments.
Yes, I just wanted to add a note about the considerable amount of work that our collegial team of members of the administrative committee and the development community have developed in kind of working through these issues. The FORA board sent back to the administrative committee several times to look more closely at how we did the projections for the future development, and we worked with the development community to think through how we would do things on a product basis, how many units per month we're likely to sell per product type. That helped us with our projections, and so we're very comfortable with that. There are 3 items in here that are very much going to be policy decisions this board has to wrestle with next month. We'd like to hear about on those issues. One has to do with what we have been calling for at least 8 years, the voluntary contribution that we are making towards keeping the capital facilities rate at a lower level at MCWD. That was part of our development fee program, and it came out of contingencies, and it was something we did for lots of years. We don't currently have an agreement with MCWD for how those collections would get to them, and as we all saw last year and more recently, they are including the cost for all of their capital charges in that fee, so that they would control that. So the recommendation by EPS to remove it is based on the fact that we don't want duplication. If you want FORA to continue to collect that fee, we'd have to establish an agreement with MCWD about how that money would go from us to them, and we'd also have to define what happens when FORA goes away in 2020 and how those fees would then be paid to MCWD. Not that it can't be done, it can. It's just that that's a policy question this board will need to wrestle with. Another policy question has to do with this HCP endowment. Senator Monning has been trying to work with us, and we have been working with the State of California Fish and Wildlife Department with respect to that. Currently, they are requiring a substantial amount of our funds to be with NIFWIF, which is a lower rate, which requires a higher development fee than what we might be able to get if we sustain our credit capability at FORA. Working with our local investment and banking institutions, we can get a higher return rate, which means we have to put lower dollars in the endowment for it to long-term protect our habitat on the base. And this to protect all of the habitat on the base in support of what State Parks does and also in support of what BLM does. So it's in support of the National Monument as well. So that's another policy question that the board has to wrestle with about how we address that question. Those are the 2 big ones in this. And Jonathan, the third would be currently how we factor in Preston Park. Because if we were to have sold Preston Park when the board told us to, we would have had the funds available to work right now with California State University Monterey Bay on how we could complete Surplus 2 and the Stockade and Marina and make that part of that overall base-wide effort to remove buildings that are creating blight. So there's a number of issues that are policy questions that are affected by this presentation.
What the FORA staff is asking for is input, direction with regard to the CIP and the draft resolution. Any member of the board have any input? Supervisor Parker.
I don't know, Chair Eden, why you looked at me first. I do have a couple of questions. One is, do we have some sense, of when we're likely to know what's going on with the HCP endowment payout rate? I guess my concern would be in reducing fees before we know what's going on, and then I guess related to this is what happens if we reduce the FORA fee and then something changes where we need to essentially raise that fee again in the future? How does that work?
Yeah, as far as when we get to that point, it would be based on when we have an HCP approved. So we're looking at taking it public for a public review period, 90 days, with probably by December at the latest this calendar year. That's our current target. So once that public review period goes through and there's comments back, then there's revisions to the document, but that's when you get really certain about what the HCP would look like.
So essentially, by the time that whole process plays out, we might be looking at next year's fee adjustment. I mean, if we wanted to be as careful as possible, we might defer, make the most conservative calculation here. And I guess it goes to, I mean, what does happen if we essentially guess wrong right now, and it's a worse case than we've imagined in terms of like that we need to have more money in the contingency or put more money into the HCP contingency or endowment. What's the mechanism? Do we then next year have to raise the FORA fee again commensurate?
Yeah, so the process for the formula calculation, it's every 2 years, but if there's a major change to the CIP in the cost structure, whether it's more costly or less costly, we can also do another fee calculation at that point. So if that scenario plays out and the cost of the HCP goes up, then we would do the recalculation at that point.
Because I have a concern about the HCP, partly because the county has such a large liability. My concern is the way it's been being funded is, I think it's about 25% of the fees. Some portion of the fees gets set aside into the HCP, and as the fees are going down, that's less money going in. And I just am concerned that we make sure that we're as prudent as possible. The
Supervisor?
Yes.
That 25% that's collected now is of all the fees that are paid, developer fees or CFD taxes. And I think one of the recommendations that EPS is making is that if the fee is going to be dropped, we are going to need to increase that percentage in order to be able to continue to build the endowment. That's a part of our recommendation.
Thank you. Yes, that was.
The percentage of the development fee and community facilities district tax, they're sort of aligned together. The developer fee is for the areas that are not within the community facilities district. So there's a developer fee and community facilities district tax. Those items are collected by and large to pay for environmental CEQA mitigations. That includes the habitat conservation plan. This board made a decision several years ago that 25% of all of those collections would be set aside and put in a fund. It now has about $6 million in it that is set aside for habitat conservation endowment. In order to continue to grow that, and the term is the stay ahead provisions, we have to stay ahead of the development that we have to protect the habitat before the development occurs. We would have to slightly increase that, or at some percentage, 30% maybe, or some other number. If the number goes down, the higher percentage will need to go to HCP provisions in order for us to stay ahead.
Thank you. Then getting to the voluntary contribution for the water augmentation, I think it makes sense to not have duplication. I guess I don't remember, and I think I can't remember if it would come to us, but a lot of things with Marina Coast's fees come to us for approval and that sort of thing. And I remember there was discussion that they wanted to increase their capacity charge, but have they done that?
It will be presented with this year's budget to the FORA board. So we're based off of the study they did last fall that prepared them for this budget, is what the analysis is based on.
Okay, and so the idea is that this would go ahead concurrently. I guess my stipulation would be that we remove the voluntary contribution once the capacity charge has been adopted, and if something were to happen to that capacity charge, I think we'd have to go back to the voluntary contribution, somehow making them tied to each other so that we don't land up with no money for that augmented water supply. So I think for me, if you look at the voluntary contribution and you look at the HCP question, when you look at the sensitivity analyses, if you take a more cautious approach to both of those, you're essentially your fee reduction almost goes away. You get back to $26,500 or something rather than the 27, whatever it is. And so, I guess for me, the recommended 17.1% is a little precipitous and premature, because we are going to know presumably pretty soon about the HCP. I'd rather be as conservative as possible. If we're trying to create stability and predictability for the developers and the jurisdictions, careening around with our development fee seems like it's counterproductive. So I'd rather just keep it a little steadier over time, and if we end up next year finding that the HCP contingency isn't needed or it's less, we know what the payout rate's going to be, then we can make a reduction or not based on what we know instead of hoping and then having to change. I'd also, and it may be that as we adopt the CIP, we will simultaneously be adopting the budget and MCWD's capacity charge. If that all goes forward together, then that's hunky-dory. But things don't usually go that smoothly here, so I want to make sure that we don't sort of do the opposite of duplication and get to a point where we're really not providing for the need for augmented water supply in some way. So yeah. Those are my comments. And I guess process question, we're giving input today, and then yes, we're going to bring this back next month with the budget for
That's correct.
Vote. Great.
Yeah, and also with regard to HCP, Senator Monning will be going up with a FORA team next month on the 23rd, and after 17 years of bureaucracy with the state, hopefully they will be able to get some sort of resolution, and so we'll get your answers here sooner rather than later.
That's why I was a little reluctant to ask, when do we think we'll know? Because
you don't want to jinx it.
Quite the
it's
long
only been
process.
17 years. That's
right.
The state government working.
Really, thanks.
Okay. Other questions or guidance? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I believe we're still in the questions for understanding rather than trying to share a whole bunch of opinions. But I would like first to say thank you for the very excellent and thorough work. It has a lot of stuff in it. Every number produces a new opportunity for anxiety, but it flows nicely, and it looks fairly understandable, and I think if I spent even more time I might understand it better. But here's one of the things that kind of emerged for me is the there's a big bulge of development coming over the next couple of years. We're relatively conservative at the moment. And the question on this augmented water that started to trigger in my mind is Marina Coast actually in a position to provide the water needed to match this forecast? Or do they have to do some new construction that hasn't been done yet?
So Marina Coast currently pulls the water supply from the groundwater sources, and they're currently using about a third of what's available for the 6,600 acre feet. So it's really in the out years, or I don't know, it's looking at around 2017, about that time is when augmented water supplies could be tapped, but it's not in the next 2 or 3 years. It's coming out in the later half of the development projection.
The prompting for this is looking at the challenge on the Monterey Peninsula of trying to create new water sources. It just seems to take a long time. We're up to about 30 years now, so if the water supply is not yet in place, I just hope that everybody who's looking to do major developments in that time is aware that it could be an issue. The voluntary contribution, how voluntary was that? What was the source? And is this something we can walk away from and just say, oh, here, it's really yours? And I'll preface that, by the way, with saying my personal belief is when you line up the the authority and the obligation level to assess fees to the people who are actually responsible for doing the work. It's a preferable outcome. So the voluntary contribution always felt kind of squishy to me as a FORA obligation. But
so originally the FORA CIP did not include this MCWD voluntary contribution, and in 2005 that changed. MCWD was in a similar situation with doing a capacity charge and a fee study for themselves. Instead of doing a fee increase in 2005, FORA took it into our CIP as a voluntary obligation, so they wouldn't have to do that capacity charge increase. So it's something that was originally theirs, came into our CIP, and the recommendation is to go back to MCWD's CIP program, fee program.
So I'll share thoughts on that when we're in the process of expressing our opinions after public comment.
Okay. I've been advised by legal counsel to announce that we've lost our quorum. However, we will continue as this meeting as a meeting of the whole. There are no action items. Mostly it's information and providing input to the staff. So we'll continue on. Other comments, initial comments? Yes.
Yes, I appreciate that we won't be voting on anything tonight, but this is a very complicated document, and I appreciate your presentation. I am glad we're going to get some time to really think about it. I have to concur with Supervisor Parker that I'm a little concerned about the uncertainty in here, but I think we all need some time to just kind of really look at this and look at the figures.
Thank you. Other comments, initial comments? Yes. Victoria.
I just had a few questions that are in different categories. One is, I think it's clarified for me now, but I want to hear a little bit more about the endowment. So how long have we been collecting money? We need to get from $6 million to $40 million. And how long have we been collecting? Have we been doing that effectively so that we're on pace to get to $40 million before the end? And you seem to be indicating, Michael, that we're going from, if we lower developer fees, what we're doing is transferring that collection process to an ongoing fee. Is that what I don't understand, I guess. I'm asking for clarification. In other words, a developer fee has to do with the, it's a one-time, construction related, and then I thought what you were saying is that we have another mechanism for collecting with the endowment, but maybe you clarify that further and tell me about the pace we're on for $40 million.
The endowment fund that we have now, $6 million or so, is generated by a share, a 25% portion of each developer fee or community facilities tax, which are essentially the same. They're just they cover different properties on the former Fort Ord. They're both developer fees, but one is called the Community Facilities District tax. It was adopted by this board under Mello-Roos. The other is a policy that the board adopted before that, which we have collected fees for areas not inside the Mello-Roos district. All properties on the former Fort Ord have an obligation to pay their fair share of the environmental impact report requirements, the mitigations. So at 25%, we would not be able to assure that we are collecting sufficient funds to build the endowment in the way we would need to continue to provide the coverage for protecting the habitat areas on the base. At 30%, I think, is currently what we're recommending. That would allow us to stay ahead. So it would be of those, it's the same, but there are two titles. And so you'll see this every place. It'll say CFD/developer fee.
Okay.
And that's why it's slated that way. There are other ways that we can collect funds that could go into the endowment. We have looked at grants in the past. We've worked with BLM on special ways that we can do that. There are funds that are out there right now looking to assist and support areas where there's restoration and or other kinds of protections. We've met on our legislative mission a few times with others. We also use a portion of our collections to pay the University of California for their work that they do in protecting habitat on the base. They have a specific role and responsibility in the HCP, and we've had an agreement with them for 8 years, I believe. 8 or 9 years, and so that's how we do that. The difference really we were talking about, there are some state laws that have been getting in our way. The state law says that if you have this kind of provision and you don't take an easement over this property, the only way we're going to assure that you are getting enough money in here is if you put it with us and we're holding the money. and that's sort of that's a really bad result for a local community that has to raise $20 million more just because one agency won't take an easement over its own property when it took property for that purpose. That's an issue we have to resolve later, and that's one that Senator Monning is going to help us with. So all of that is how we're going to deal with this, and whether it's a private entity or whether it's a public entity that handles the endowment makes the difference as to what the payout rate is going to be.
So the payout rate, I understand, is an issue, and I'd like to ask a question about that, but I don't want. I actually have other questions. I don't want to take up too much time, but I still don't understand. We're at $6 million. We need to get at least $34 million more to get to the low number of the 40, and then there was a high number of $67 million. So I don't know how. FORA has been in existence for a decade and a half, and $6 million at this point, and 4 more years, and 40, or I just don't quite see. Do we have to? I mean, I understand the stay ahead, and I understand that if we, if development is moving at one pace and we need to stay ahead of it, and that you're saying it's around a 30%, going from 25% to 30% on the. But I don't see how you get to 40 or 67 million.
We're not expecting to get to that full funding for 15 years or more.
Okay.
Because it would have to be upon the build out pretty much close to Fort Ord. Right now we're at 18% of what our projected build out is, David. So that's why we're at $6 million. If we get closer to 100%, we'll get very close to 40 million. Okay. But the percentage collection will actually keep us ahead of what the full build out is. So the full build out requirement is not necessary to fully fund the endowment.
And we don't have to finish by 2020 is what you're telling me. That's right. There was if you don't mind, I hate to keep going, but I do have a couple other clarification questions. On page 25, there's a actual collection of 1.5 million versus forecasts of 11 million. Throughout the staff report, there were actual collections and forecasts. Are those forecasts from way back? Are they forecasts that were fairly current? Did we really think we were getting $11 million in any kind of recent time frame, but we only got a tenth of that?
12 months ago.
12 months ago, we thought we were going to get 11 million. Okay. The other question I wanted to raise was about transportation and transit. This list here, the obligation list that we have, and also in the staff report, is this an obligation list that is for the foreseeable future, or is this sort of a contemporary list for this year? Or, I mean, I know these are going out further, but I guess the question is, are they exhaustive? Are they meant to capture everything we think we know of till the end of FORA?
They are exhaustive.
Okay.
We actually studied all of the routes in '97. We adopted the specific routes as assigned by us, both on base and off base. That was updated in 2005 by our wonderful colleagues from TAMC. And I think we mentioned in our report earlier, TAMC is at least thinking about the possibility of another reallocation study at some point in the future. Our fair share of the obligations regionally, the number is the same. What those route applications are might change.
The reason I asked this one, again, just to staff, is that my understanding of the base reuse plan is that it is meant to emphasize transit-oriented development, smart growth, et cetera, a lot of the things we talked about at the colloquium. And yet, most of the list is, I would say, transportation, but not transit. I know Debbie would know better than I do, what the premium is for one or the other. Is transit more expensive generally? I would think it would be, public transit type of things versus road work, but I actually don't know the answer to that question. I probably should from my alternate duties on TAMC. But I wonder if we are taking enough into account, even though I'm sure this list is exhaustive, but if we really are staying true to the base reuse transit orientation of the plan, will we not incur perhaps in a future date later obligations on that? That's just a question. And then the last, I think, line of questioning was, you don't have to answer that transit one, you just maybe chew on that for next time. The idea of, it follows on Superintendent Parker's question. I sometimes think there's there's an unintended consequence we might be dealing with when we're lowering fees. I like the idea of always being alert to reconciling the costs and what we really need. There's no point in collecting more than we really need. However, and one of the good things about that is that you are encouraging folks who want to finish the base use plan and develop the property to do it at the best, most efficient cost. However, if we do run into something because we're not conservative enough, what that does is concentrate or consolidate the hurt, the financial hurt, on future projects, not the immediate future projects, but then projects after that. So it has the effect, I would think, if you were doing sort of a macroeconomic look at it, of accelerating the earlier projects and potentially decelerating or halting even further future projects, because the money you need now has to be spread among fewer people because it's less development that is left to be completed. So it's something that I don't know how to deal with, but I throw it out there as a question. I would hate to sort of incentivize something in the very near term with the opposite result of hurting, you know, the longer term development. But maybe you all have an answer to that. It's just I did take Econ 101, so I just was wondering about that.
Thank you. Any other questions, initial questions by board members? Yes, Debbie.
When we first started this discussion about the update to the CIP, there was discussion of updating the project costs. The TMC did the reallocation study almost 10 years ago. Since that time, we've updated our own fee program twice, and we have looked at differential impacts, and the projects do change in our fee program. But the costs also change tremendously, and yet the costs in this plan are fixed in that 2005 years. They're escalated by engineering costs, but as the projects become more defined, then we know more about the projects, and I can tell you that they've gone up tremendously since the time that it was first defined. So I wanted to find out if you plan to update those costs, because our understanding was that that was going to be part of this, and I guess if that's so, I would expect that to happen before you lowered the fee, because if the costs happen to go up, then we might not have adequate mitigations. The other, I guess I can save some of my other questions for, I'll phrase this as a question and make some more comments later. Have you heard of a situation in which you know less and you decrease your contingency? In my experience, the more you know about a project cost, the higher the contingency is. And yet you're proposing to do the opposite. You're proposing to eliminate the contingency on all the non-FORA projects and keep it for the FORA projects, which tend to be in the nearer term of the program. I would not imagine folks that are responsible for delivering of the projects that don't get to keep their contingency are very pleased with that, and that would include us.
John, David.
So just as we view contingencies, typically in our experience, the less you know about, the less certain you are about a cost, the more important it is to have a contingency in place to mitigate for that uncertainty. So that means as you gain information and you gain understanding and you gain certainty, the contingency that's required to satisfy your knowledge and your understanding of that is reduced over time.
So why are you proposing to remove the contingency on the projects that are further out in the program, that have the least amount of knowledge about them? Like, for instance, the Highway 156 project, the Davis Road and projects.
We're not, in this case, singling out any particular projects for differential contingency changes. It's simply an across-the-board move to adjust the contingency based on the overall level of certainty.
Except for the FORA projects, which get to keep their contingency.
Well, that's something that we think is worth as I mentioned, a second look. So as we look at those, if we were to apply a contingency only to the FORA costs, we would want to look very closely at what that appropriate amount is before we came down with a solid recommendation. Right now, we're recommending that we go with the base case, and that would be the 15% applied across the board to both the FORA and the TAMC costs.
Okay, I guess I would recommend from a staff level that we look at all the project costs again, because we do have updated information, and I know the county does as well.
Sure.
And then take a look at what level of contingency is appropriate.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions by board members, initial questions? Saying none, let's go out to the public. Any questions, comments by members of the public? Yes, sir.
Members of the FORA board, Bill Carruthers, Mr. Campy, I have terrible news for you. Friedrich Nietzsche said it best. That man who is laughing has not heard the terrible news. Anyone who has any awareness of the level of corruption, incompetence, denial, and so forth of the Monterey County Water Resources Agency and their deliberate attempts to obscure the coming collapse of our aquifers and so forth, and their total determination not to even measure, as Peter Drucker said, that which cannot be measured cannot be managed. They have a wonderful excuse. They're not even measuring. And so forth. The surge in building is unfortunately unrealistic based on the actual management of the water resources, or mismanagement. If you look upon the loss of water, groundwaters that were contaminated beyond the 500 part per million salinity point last year, we are looking at 9,000 acre feet. The whole annual water consumption of the city of Salinas is only 20,000. The sooner that we line up the sheriff and get every single member of the Monterey County Water Resources Board to enter the building, remove their personal property, and be forever banished from public employment again, the sooner we will have some control over the coming aquifer watershed collapse of the Salinas Valley. It is totally, and anyone will tell you that I speak from knowledge. I've attended the meetings. I know whereof I speak.
Yeah, sir, I think you might be confusing the Water Resources Agency with the Marina Coast Water District.
No, not at all.
How does the Water Resources Agency fit in the discussion we're having right now with regard to the CIP?
Water rights are created by attorneys. There are far more water rights than there is water.
Your time is up, sir.
If you believe that there is ever going to be a surge in construction and everything, I hate to burst your bubble, but I will be delighted to show you data and so forth and everything. So don't make these plans. They are not based on water reality.
Thank you, sir. Next public speaker.
Good afternoon, Chris Austin with Development Planning and Financing Group. I'm the peer review consultant for the BIA. We've had the pleasure the last 3 years to be part of this process, and I can say that we are refining the variables that we're reviewing, and I would say that we are adhering to the formulaic approach, although there is one key thing that we're not focusing on. That's step number one. That's the cost. And I think I've seen that comment here a couple times, is that these costs have been held over from 98, 2005, then escalated. We've not done the work to go in and do the real cost estimating to see that we have the right revenue, because if we have the right cost, then we can eliminate all the conversation about contingency because we know what it costs today. And so that's our concern, is that we keep spending time in CFD and CIP administration without advancing the cause of these actual improvements. We're not seeing design level analysis. We're not costing these out so we can get rid of contingency conversations, say, this costs this much, let's go build it. And so our concern is that we're not getting the kind of the bang for our buck as far as advancing this process. So we would want to work with staff to do the work to cost these improvements out, to eliminate all these additional contingency conversations. Additionally, the sensitivity analysis that was presented, we talked about Monday in our meeting. We hadn't seen it till today, so we'd want to have time to review that and make sure that we concur with the analysis. I think that's our main concern, is that we've been kind of kicking the can down the road on some of these improvement costs without actually doing the work to say it costs this much versus it costs this much in 97, it's gone up by 3%, here we are. We want to have the right fee, not the lowest fee, and that's been our basis since day one, is let's eliminate contingency and have the right fee so that we're mitigating our impacts. That's been our chore from day one. And so then those are our comments. We want to, again, kind of work with staff, work with EPS to make sure we have the right number, not the low number. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other public comment on this issue? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Dennis Martin. I am with BIA, and I want to echo Chris Austin's comments that we feel that while the development fee policy was a good step in the right direction for this board 2 years ago, and that the resulting reduction of development impact fees is welcome, we do feel that our approach has always been to seek the right-sized fee to make sure that all the improvements are accurately accounted for and buildable. This CIP does fall short in accounting for those costs in a rigorous manner, and we would encourage the board to direct staff to return to the table with the agencies that they interact with here, with TAMC and with others, to make sure that those costs are accurately depicted in the CIP and that the fee is, at the end of the day, reflective of what it's actually going to cost to build the improvements. We do encourage you to take that dive now and not put it off till the future. Don't kick this can down the road. It's a good time to take it up now. We do have development on the way, and we want to make sure that we have the improvements here that our residents are going to be able to enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Any other public comment? Okay, seeing none, public comment period's closed. Back to the board. Mayor Camp, I believe you had some direction you wanted to provide initially.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess a couple things now come to my mind. One is on the water issue, which was in my mind in particular. I hope that at the time we have the joint meeting with Marina Coast, that their determination and conviction of getting the impact fees they need to be able to deliver the services they're obligated to deliver is clear and manifest in their willingness to insert those fees in their rate case. And I would express some skepticism based on what I know today that we're moving in that direction. I hope to be proven wrong. I do want to comment on one of our speakers who I think in the most inappropriate way made very direct criminal accusations. I think it's a great thing to take to the district attorney. I don't think they're appropriate in this forum, and I was disappointed to hear it. In terms of the comments we've just heard from BIA, I heard concerns about doing it right, but I didn't hear any indication of what you feel is wrong. Are you saying the rates or the impact fees are not high enough, or they're too high? Unless there's something more tangible in the feedback, this becomes a futile exercise of I don't like it, go do it again. I don't like it, go do it again. That is not a helpful input to us, unfortunately, to get us to where we need to go. And my view, and I've expressed this several months ago, is the BIA has asked for adjustment after adjustment after adjustment to the impact fees. We're not seeing the building going on. Where are the starts? And unfortunately, they have been way under the forecast for a long time now. Help us get to the right place. Part of it is if you do have feedback on the fees, give us something we can work with, but encourage your members to actually build some projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Any other direction from board members? Yes, Supervisor Parker.
Thank you. Just something that I had noticed and then had forgotten to mention, and then when Victoria Beach talked about the amount of money that was forecast to be collected and how much actually was, since it's significantly less than had been anticipated, and some of that could or should have generated some of the offsetting revenue that's in the formula, it raises even more questions in my mind as to why we're reducing the fees further when we really haven't brought in the revenues that we had anticipated in last year's reduction. So I just think as we're looking at this, we need to really take all of this into account. And so when we come back, maybe some of that can be explained. But if property tax is supposed to be in there and we had so much less building than had been projected, and I still think the projections are a bit rosy as they are for this year's projection, and land sale proceeds were so significantly lower than projected, and that's another revenue source that's supposed to offset these fees. I'm just puzzled as to why we're looking for yet another pretty significant reduction. So, thank you.
Any other direction from board members on this item? Yes, Debbie. If
I may, just as an ex officio, and really from the staff perspective, because this hasn't come to our board, but I do have a couple of board members here, is that I am concerned that some of these projects aren't going to get adequately funded because if they were to lose their contingency amount and they don't reflect the existing cost estimates that we have for them, then I'm concerned that they won't get funded. I appreciate the fact that FORA just voted to give us $312,000 for the Highway 68 projects that we fronted to the County of Monterey, and that's the first money that's gone to any regional project in the FORA fee program. And so it is important that the off-site and the regional projects get funding from this program, and so that makes me nervous about having a fee reduction before we know exactly what the costs are going to be. And so I would advise and suggest that you take a look at the costs again of all of these projects. I would imagine the Public Works departments and Caltrans have more up-to-date cost estimates that then you could go back and either do a true nexus study or at least take the ratio based on the FORA portion done in the study 10 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Any other direction by board members? Saying none, it looks like the FORA staff and EPS have some work to do with regard to looking at the initially proposed reduction in the fees. So we're looking forward to seeing the work that will be done. Thank you very much for your work. Thanks for the briefings. Very well done. We're in a meeting of the whole, so there's no action required on this other than providing feedback to the staff and our guests there. Okay, next we have last major item on the agenda, the Florida Use Authority fiscal budget for 2014-2015. Michael?
Yes, Chair Edel and members of the board, typically in the month of May, and specifically because of the request of Supervisor Parker, we make sure that we provide the board with a no-frills overview of the 2014-2015 budget. We've done this for 2 years now. We've often presented the budget in the month of May for approval. That has happened in many years in the past. We now try to make this a two-step process so the board members can ask questions. We also provide this budget to members of the Administrative Committee, members of the Finance Committee, and members of the Executive Committee before it comes here for any kind of further direction or action. So this is a presentation today. We're not asking for any particular action of the members of the board, but we're happy to answer any questions. We can move the very first slide is the all funds combined, and I hope none of you can read that. It's intended solely to remind you that that's what's in your board packet. That has all the detail. The very next slide is going to be a summary of this, so that if you want to look at the detail, you can go back. The next slide is the all funds combined, and this summary points out that we anticipate revenues of about $11 million next year and expenditures of about $11 million, slightly less in revenue, slightly more in expenditures. Therefore, we're going to wind up with a slight deficit in our reserve fund next year because we're going to try to do what we can to expend funds primarily to address some blight removal as a result of the work that CSUMB is doing, and try to build upon their work by following them with their contractor. The next slide. So there we go. Also in your board packet, we have described for you in fairly detailed way how we align all of our funds by the individual activities. So we have multiple different funds, one for ESCA, one for pollution legal liability. We have different expenditure funds, and that's how they are aligned. The next slide will show a summary of that. And in general, our land sale revenues for the anticipated year are relatively small. Supervisor Parker has mentioned that in this meeting earlier. We're not anticipating a significant amount. We do anticipate an increase this coming year in CFD tax from developer fees. We have a number of building permits that have been pulled this year, primarily in the County of Monterey for the East Garrison project, but also for housing projects and other in the city of Seaside with their custom homes, and the city of Marina for the affordable housing project and the Promontory project. So if all comes relatively close to what's expected for this year, we should wind up with a net total amount of $7,809,000 in our fund balance. Next slide. It's not working. Okay. There is in your board packet, you will see that we are suggesting some adjustments. This is provided solely for information at this point. The staffing and salary adjustments are reviewed by the Executive Committee. They've not had a chance to review these yet to make a recommendation to the board. However, the Finance Committee recommended that all of these staff recommendations be included in the budget when it was presented to the board, and that's why you see it here. The two changes in staffing would be for adding a staff position that would focus its attention on job creation activities, focused on the work with the individual educational institutions in the region, and a 2% COLA, and the analysis for the 2% COLA is found on number 2 on this slide. Next. That's it. If you have any questions on any of these items or any direction with respect to the budget, we're happy to answer those questions.
This briefing is a little bit irregular in that normally the Executive Committee would take a look at the budget and provide input to the board here, but Michael, based on the Administrative Committee's recommendation, thought he'd throw a fast presentation together and let you see what's going on. Does anybody have any comments or any initial feedback? Again, it still has to go before the Executive Committee for comment, and this will be brought back before the board in the future. Jane?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess seeing that the forecasts for CFD developer fees last year was about 10 times greater than what was received, does the projection for the coming year, is it tied to, I think you mentioned something about, or Jonathan did, basing these estimates on entitled projects rather than just projections? I mean, do we think that the $5 million is a little bit more accurate than last year's $11 million projection?
Yeah, I would say I do. Certainly the Administrative Committee does. What we did was look at other projections that we had earlier, which were, I think, almost too 2.5 times this $5 million number. We went back to the administrative committee, went back to the development community. We looked for a reality check based on how many product types per month do you sell, how many product types do you have, what's been your experience in the past, how does this actually work, let's do this on a one. And the jurisdictions came back with much lower numbers, much more realistic numbers that reflect this lower expectation for developer fees.
Thank you. I'll hope that it's closer to realizable. I guess the one comment I wanted to make was this suggestion of adding a position for an economic development specialist. I really don't support that. I think the economic development work is work that the cities are working on. We all wish more could be happening, but I think that the cities get very irked when FORA starts doing things that the cities or the county thinks is their responsibility. And when we look at some of the competitiveness that the jurisdictions get into, and the In-N-Out Burger just comes to mind, I don't know how the FORA economic development person could figure out where to put their energy. So I just think it would be a position fraught with difficulty and very little positive outcome. And so I just think it's not a wise expenditure. So that's just my feedback.
I've been informed by legal counsel that we need to have a motion to extend the meeting. We're at the end of our normal meeting length. This shouldn't take more than another 10 minutes. If I could have a motion, please.
I'll move to extend to 5:45.
Okay, till 5:45. Mayor Camp gave the motion. Do I have a second? Supervisor Parker, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
At least you knew to say aye out the door. Okay, thank you very much. We'll quickly go on. Yes, Mayor Camp.
I just will make the quick comment. There's a table, and it's 107 in the package, and it was about the third or fourth slide, but it had the funds as the columns, and it gave some of the detail. And I really applaud the fact that we're tracking both sources and uses by fund, and I think that was something, interestingly enough, the BIA requested it, and it's kind of flowed through. The part that I wasn't quite sure how to interpret is part of the reason for doing that is certain kinds of monies are available for certain things. Like, for example, I think land sales can go to blight removal, but can they go to other things as well?
Land sales that are completely at the discretion of the board. The board decided when it adopted its financing policy 13 years ago that land sales would be focused on providing for building removal. We have used lease revenues, which also the board has complete flexibility with, for supporting some of our building removal. We use leased funds to borrow funds that were used for building removal here in Marina. So we've used both lease and land sales for building removal.
So my observation was on that table where it shows the transfers in and out, is that it seems that account got cleared by transferring to the general fund, and that was the case for a lot of these funds. They kind of got cleared out to the general fund. And so the question was, are we giving the picture of the financial flexibility and the commitment of these funds to particular use that we'd like to have? And maybe we in fact are. I was just trying to understand the picture as it kind of flowed from this particular table, which I thought was a step in the right direction.
All right,
Is it telling us what we really need to know as a board in terms of what's available for what purposes?
Sure, I think it might be, if we can, for the next time we present the budget, we know that the ESCA funds are obligated to that contract. We know that the funds that we get for community facilities district have to go for mitigations and fees because those are in the community facilities district. We know the developer fee is close to that, but slightly different than the community facilities district. Not as restricted by the district's rules. And then we know land sales and lease revenues have a different program, and then the tax revenues as well. So those major fund sources we should describe in maybe a little better way, what their flexibility is.
And I think I actually see what you're saying here in the table. Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments from the board? Seeing none, out to the audience. Any questions from the audience? Okay, back to the board. This, again, for information. We're a committee as a whole, so no problems. Next, we have public comment period.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, before we move from that, I just
Yes.
want to say I appreciate the mention that we've brought the budget in May because of my suggestion. My request actually was that we bring it in April so that we can look at it, make comments, and then it can come in May to check to see if those things have been reflected, and then in case we don't have a unanimous vote, it can come back in June and be adopted in time to be ready for the fiscal year. So that's my actual request.
For next year, you want that to happen?
Please.
Okay, staff, once you check that out, Jonathan, and come back next month and let us know. Okay? Makes sense. Thank you. Okay, again, that's the end of this discussion item. Next, we have public comment period. Any member of the public may address the board on any item not on the agenda. Any member of the public wishing to address the board? Saying none, public comment period's closed. Executive officer's report. It'll be short, very short.
Only want to note that if you look under item 12G, we are moving ahead with our work from the Regional Urban Design Guidelines Task Force. The chair appointed the task force. There are 2 members of the board, still one of them is here tonight, who are on the Regional Urban Design Guidelines Task Force, and they've done their work. We anticipate that during the month of June we will have presentations to that group for the selection of a consultant that will start work in July.
Thank you, Michael. Any items from members? Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for staying around. It's been a long meeting. I would like to acknowledge Mayor Dave Pendergrast. He's the longest-serving member on the FORA board, and you note he is still here. We have Mr. Bob Schaefer out in the audience. He's the longest-serving member of the public, and you notice he's still here. So you all look around. You guys are the hardcore. Again, thank you for the support, and go out there and enjoy the sunshine, what's left of it. Thanks.